This is another head that I did in copying the masters. It is a Charles Dana Gibson drawing that I'm copying. And you'll notice in any of the copies that I do that they're not exact likenesses. And that's, for me, it's okay, because that's not the point of this particular exercise. The point is to get comfortable seeing the way a pen and ink artist does. A painter sees very differently, has to, than how someone who's doing pen and ink does. Now, I guess let me back off that a little bit. It's not necessarily seeing differently, it's incorporating a different visual language. So for instance, if you're painting in oils or watercolor or whatever, then you're thinking in large shapes and you're trying to use usually as broad a stroke as possible to define the large shapes and go from the large to the small, from the general to the specific. And those principles are being applied when you're doing pen and ink, but the difference is you're having to think in terms of a lot of individual strokes that are defining the form. And in defining the form, you're having to decide, well, are you going with the form or against the form? And it's a judgment call. It's not necessarily going to be a right or wrong answer approach-wise, but once you get into it, then there's a certain logical consistency that you have to follow. So there are going to be times that if you're following the form with one shape and then you break out of that and you start going along with the let's see, if you're following the form with one and then going against the form with the other, you just have to be careful that you don't confuse your viewer and make the volumes incoherent where they don't make any sense. And the only way to do that is through practice, where when you're looking at something, you begin to see those linear descriptions that are defining the form. So that's where I'm doing heads over and over again, and then I'm doing figures and backgrounds and so forth. And it's beginning to pay off in that when I'm a lot of times at night watching TV and I'm looking at someone's face, all of a sudden my mind, instead of thinking in terms of a big hog hair bristle brush loaded with oil paint, thinking about carving out figure shapes in the figure and in the face, now all of a sudden I'm starting to think how I would define that with hatch marks and strokes. And well, would I go along the side of the head, or would I come across the head? Which way do I want to go? What am I trying to do? Go with the form, go against the form? Looking at the background, how would it interact with the background if I did that? That's the other thing, is you got to be careful, just like in painting, and not think in terms of one element at a time, and you're doing it all piecemeal. You've got to think in terms of, okay, this head is a part of a figure, which is a part of a background, and that background may be full of other elements. And the more complex it is, the more you have to think in terms of, well, now, how is this going to integrate with everything else? And so when I'm thinking about, okay, well, what hash marks and what hatching technique would I use to describe my central focal point? Okay, now, how is that going to integrate with the background so that it doesn't jump off the page or blend in too much, maybe just disappear into it? So it's literally learning a different visual language. And you can use what you know in other mediums, but at some point you have to just learn its own unique language. And the beautiful thing about this is that I have never learned a disparate technique, something that I really didn't know anything about or wasn't real comfortable with. I mean, I do pen and ink work, so I understand it and I work in it. I just don't use this technique that much. But I've never done something like this where I copied a lot of master works, tried a new style, tried a new medium. I've never done it that it didn't pay off in spades, that really sooner than later down the road, all of a sudden I'd be working on a picture that the new style would just flow right into and make it so much easier to do. I will tell you, my pen and ink work has, and I'm talking about my comic book type pen and ink work that's mostly linear with, depending on mostly outlines with feathering brush techniques that comic book artists use. And I did a lot of that for years. And that has paid off so much in my really very realistic oil paintings and watercolor paintings, because what would happen is I would get into a subject, and prior to doing a lot of inking work, I would try and over render. I would just work too hard at it. And one thing comic book art teaches you is to reduce things to really two values, because you got your white paper and you got your black solid shadows, and that's it, and just a little bit of a feathering technique with the brush to make a transition between the two. There's not really any cross hatching, none of that. It's super simple. And oh my goodness, what that does is it just makes it where you start seeing everything in terms of two values, just the white and the black. I think that's called notan, N-O-T-A-N, notan, where you're looking at your subject just in terms of the two values of black and white. Tremendously valuable in any approach that you take, in any medium that you use, because it teaches you to simplify what you're looking at. And especially if you get into a technique like what I'm doing here, it can become really busy, really overdone very quickly. And that's where copying a master will help you see how he or she solved those problems, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Simplifying is so important when you get into something like doing pen and ink work. So getting in and studying what the masters did, that prevents you from having, again, to reinvent the wheel. Now, the Orientals took this to great heights with their work, where if you look at calligraphy paintings by Japanese and Chinese masters, well, what the apprentices would do is paint everything exactly like their masters. And they would not start really expressing themselves in their manner until far into their career. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that that's the way to do it. That can become very restrictive and prevent innovation and growth. And if you look, to be fair, Chinese calligraphy, Japanese calligraphy paintings, they didn't change a whole lot over the centuries, and that was That, I think, was the downside, is that you didn't have the amount of play and innovation that you would from, say, more of a westernized approach. But I don't think that either way is terrible, or either way is fantastic and perfect. They're just approaches, they're techniques that, if used properly, can produce tremendous results very quickly. So all I'm saying is, take an approach like this and really run with it for a while, but then, when you're ready, you can take this stuff and start applying your own technique to it. And I'm already starting to do that a little bit. I'm starting to see how Charles Dana Gibson would interpret his subject, and as I'm copying, I'm beginning to drift a little bit at times away from what he does or he did. So that's what will happen, is that as you get more and more comfortable, you'll begin to drift into your own approach. But one thing I will caution, I remember in college, our professor would say, you got to learn the rules before you break them. And being typical impatient college students, we took that as, okay, I did a painting, I've learned the rules, now I can break them. No. You do, I'd say, copy 100 Gibsons, 100 Heinrich Clays, 100 James Montgomery flags. You do that, and then you can say, okay, I've really begun to get a little bit of a handle on this guy's work. But don't just do one copy and think, oh yeah, I've done it. And another reason to copy work is that it teaches you the difference between looking and seeing. And it's all the difference in the world. We look at stuff all the time without seeing it. And a perfect example is, how often have you or someone you're with been driving your car down the road, and all of a sudden someone says, wow, look at that new sign. When did they put that up? And everybody else in the car is going, 11 years ago. And they'll sit there and argue with you. No, it's not. It's brand new. Well, it's because they're just sort of going through the motion, getting from point A to point B. They're looking at what's around them enough to keep from having a wreck. But as far as actually seeing, analyzing what's going on around them, that's not happening. And when you're sitting there and you're copying someone else's work and you really get into it and you do it over and over again, now you're becoming analytical. You're actually seeing what that person did, as opposed to just looking at what they did. So, okay, I haven't gone much into what I'm using, the tools and the different media, and that's okay. You can go to some of my other videos where I go into that and learn from that. Nothing real special there. That's one thing I want to also point out, is that the tools will not necessarily make you a master. Now, you don't want to try to drive a nail with a screwdriver, so you do want to make sure you're using the proper tools. But don't be fooled into thinking, well, if I could find out the exact paper and the exact pen that Charles Dana Gibson was using, then I could do what he did. Well, no, not without a tremendous amount of practice, you won't. But also, if you do want to copy what he did, you do want to be sure that you are at least reasonably close to the tools he was using, so that the materials aren't fighting with you. All right, well, I think we'll put this drawing to rest. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this episode of The Arthropologist, please hit the like button. And if you'd like to see more episodes like this, think about subscribing. I'm Bill Wilson, and I'm The Arthropologist.